Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, my name is Atul Tripathi and I am an honorary adjunct fellow at National Maritime Foundation. So welcome to this ESG Analytics and Green Finance series. Today we'll be talking about principles in practice as far as your SDGs are concerned, the bonds, the green bond, the SLBs that we call them, what are the principles around them, what are the playbooks, what about the data and the taxonomy, and most importantly, we'll also look at a few terminals with respect to how do you ingest data at a large scale when it is coming around, and how do you play around with all that, So let's go ahead and let's see what we can do about it, and it's going to be an interesting session out here. So when we start off, we're going to start off with the first thing first, that is, why does this principles in the sustainability finance matter? Actually, why does it matter? Because without principles, green is just a label. With them, it becomes comparable, investable, and accountable asset class trusted by global capital. The trust will come only when it has been, there's been such principles that have been set around. The factor that, it has to be investable, it has to be comparable. How do you compare all these factors? How do you make it accountable? All that is going to come only when you have principles around it. And that's why the principles matter, because the green bond principles and the social bond principles and the sustainability bond guidelines, so GBP, SBP, and SBG, and sustainability linked bond principle SLBP, for everybody is just for the reference in coming days. So just for the reference for that, is being referenced by 95% of sustainable bond issuers in 2025, making them de facto global issuance standard for international sustainable bond market. That's the main focus principle around it. And when you look at the principle, it looks at all the factors, what is the use of proceeds, what are the general purposes, you have the product standardization, then you have the green enabling project guidelines, sustainability linked loans, financing guidelines. That is where the complementary or the thematic guidelines will come into picture. So all of them combined together is the one that is going to give us the entire principal factor, because you see what counts as secondary. So secondary perils, it includes severe consecutive storms. So why voluntary principles? They are going to be outperforming your fragmented rules, because principles are the one that is going to be providing you with the flexible market-led guidelines, and that is the one that is going to evolve rapidly with the practitioner input and accommodation of the diverse jurisdictions, which are very important, because you're looking also greenwashing and other challenges that will come in down the line. We'll also talk about it, briefly touch in this lecture series today as well. The various sectors that are involved, the innovations of the products, the requirement of the legislative cycles, the regulatory harmonization, the delay factors, the jurisdiction factors, all of them combined together is the one that is the reason why you have this principles factor coming into picture. And there are 4 different core components for the GBP, SBP, and SBG, and the 5 pillars of SLBs. Again, we'll talk it out in a few minutes down the line in more detail. But primarily, they're around the use of proceed bonds there, which is requiring your disclosures of eligible categories where you're trying to project your evaluation and selection of the governance, the management of proceeds. What about the allocation of impact reporting? How will you create a standardized data fields? Investors, how do you screen them consistently across insurers and geographies? That is what comes from the investor's perspective. Then you have the sustainability linked bonds, which are requiring your material KPIs, your ambitious SPTs, meaningful variations in bond characteristics, your reporting, robust forms of reporting. What about the external verification factors? Because there has to be a third party verification that is going to be taking place. Something we talked in the last session. How will you enable your performance-based comparisons? What are the mitigating awareness as far as the strategies or the risk management factors that you need to take into consideration? As far as the greenwashing risk is concerned, you have to have your structured accountability. How will you reduce your transaction cost and enable scaling? That's another important factor as far as the principles are concerned, because when insurers will align to ICMA, the investors can deploy the standardized diligence templates. Will be having data vendors, because they're the ones that are going to ingest your machine readable fields. Then you will have multiple index providers, because that is where the automation of the eligibility screening will come into pictures. Then the underwriters from the insurance will come into pictures, because that is where you are going to compare your prices, competitively or comparably. And so the lowering of the friction and the broadening of the distribution is what we are looking at primarily as a principal factor. And then therefore comes another important point is the trust and the integrity, because the ICMA's balance of issuer, investor, underwriter representation in governance, this is the one that is going to ensuring that the principles evolve to address your greenwashing concern, the tightening of the verification expectations, and the maintenance of the credibility with the regulators and the civil society, and most importantly the investors themselves. Again, when one looks at the interoperability and the taxonomies and the regulations, so the principles are complementary and they're not exactly comparative in nature. That's an important factor. We often tend to get mired with the fact that they are comparative. No, they're not. They're just complementary, because something we'll again look at it, because their issue is mapping your ICMA aligned frameworks to regional taxonomies. You have the EU taxonomy or the national green classifications, and there is a use of principles to satisfy disclosures expectations under the emergence of sustainable finance regulations, so as to avoid duplication, and you have to enable your cross-border acceptance. Then the market evolution and innovation, again, something again as a part of the sustainability principles, that is, of sustainable finance principles. When you look at the ICMA is updating the principles regularly, and most recently it has happened as recently as 2025 itself, where they have incorporated learnings on harmonized impact reporting, to green enabling projects, to relevance of the markets as maturity, the new emergence of the themes that are coming around in the sustainability linked bonds, or the green markets that are there. So the external reviews and assurances, again, as we talked about, as a mark of quality, signals. This is very important, because the principles encourage second-party opinions, verification, certification, and bond screening scores, so as to enhance your credibility. And these reviews are now baselining for the expectations from the investor's perspective. They support index inclusion. They ensure that there is lower new issuance concessions, and there's the complete regulatory comfort when it comes down to this point of assurances to the investors at the large scale. Therefore, this external review and assurance of the quality is very, very important factor that we need to look at. That brings us to another important point, and that is regarding the four pillars, which are very important points. So because of the green investable bond, because green bond principle, or GBP as they're called, as SBP, and the sustainability bond guidelines and sustainability linked principles, they are being referenced by 97% of sustainability bond issuers in 2024. Now, this is a very large number we are looking at, almost covering the entire market segment, and that is why these four green principles are becoming very, very important. And then basically these principles are around the use of proceeds, to project evaluation selections, the management of proceeds, and the reporting factors. So these are the four pillars which constitute your principles, or the green bond principle as they called as, because when we look at it from the perspective of the operating system of UOP, or use of proceeds as we'll call them, it actually means that the green bond principles, they are going to provide you a common framework that is going to standardize how issuers are going to define your eligible green bond activities, what are the ring fencing that they need to take care of, what are the tracking of the proceeds, how will you report your allocation, what are the impact of the so-called investors, and how will you evaluate the credibility across the geographies and sectors across the board. Then there is going to be an alignment of green bond principles, which is going to reduce your diligence friction, support your index inclusion policies, and the migration of the greenwashing risk by anchoring disclosures to widely accepted components and templates. So these are main focus areas, or the main points why there should be a green bond principles, or the four pillars have been defined for. Let's look at one at a time. The first component is around the use of proceeds, where there's a dedication of funds entirely. So the proceeds are being exclusively applied to eligible green categories such as renewable energy, your energy efficiency, clean transportation, water and waste management, circularity of the economy, the climate adaptation, and therefore the clarity on any exclusions is going to be an important factor that needs to be taken into consideration. And that is where the issuer should disclose the share of financing versus refinancing. What are the look back periods for the refinanced assets? How allocation advance will being defined environmental objectives. What are the relevant taxonomies one is looking at? Then the second principle one is looking at is a segment of project evaluation and selection, which is primarily talking about the chosen based on certain criteria or environmental impact, because you're there, the process of project evaluation and selection becomes very important, because the framework should describe the decision processes, the eligibility criteria, the environmental objectives, and they should include how material and environmental and social risks they are being identified and being managed during the project selection. What the governance should outline roles, what are the oversight of the bodies, how selection will align with this broader sustainability strategy, what are the due diligence procedures to ensure there's an integrity that is maintained all the time. Then the third pillar, which is the management of proceeds, which is application of funds, and that how the transparency is going to be there, how will you track, how will you manage it out. Therefore, the issuers are expected to track the net proceeds via internal systems. It can be sub-accounting or register or portfolio approach based, so as to disclose the temporary placement of unallocated balances and target the full allocation of the defined timeline. Then you have the transparent controls and the period internal, external verification of allocations, improvement in terms of auditability, investor confidence that needs to be taken into consideration while you're doing your ring fencing and the policy factors. And finally, the most important point is about the reporting, something we have been stressing over and over and over again in all my previous lecture series as well, because this is where your regular updates are going to be there on the environmental impact and the funded projects, how funds are being allocated, how they're being managed out. At least one annual allocation reporting is expected until there is a complete allocation with the updates thereafter, has to be at a very regular frequency. So if there is any material changes that is occurring, alongside the impact that is there on the reporting where feasible with the relevant KPIs and the clear methodologies that needs to be followed. Then you have the method notes, which should state your baselines, your emission factors, your calculation approaches, the boundaries, how you enable the comparability, the reproducibility across years and issuers. So these are the important factors that one needs to take into consideration when one looking at the reporting as a fourth pillar of the green bond principles. And then that also brings us to another important factor, and that is around your green bond principles with the ICMA alignment, the operating value and the use of proceeds, as we call it. Turning green promises into an investable discipline is what is the principle around the operation of use of proceeds. So you have the certain core elements like management, use, reporting, project evaluation, green bond frameworks, and external verification. Again, reiterating myself, in terms of use of proceeds, the proceeds must be exclusively allocated to eligible green categories. So you have to mention whether it is a renewable or energy efficiency, clean transportation, water adaptation, and there has to be a clarity on financing versus refinancing and looking back periods, and if there are any inclusions or exclusions that have taken place, that has to be very clearly mentioned. So the issuers should describe how to use proceeds, what are the advancement and what are the stated environmental objectives, and where is it appropriate being referenced or recognized rather. What are the recognized taxonomies? What are the technical screening criteria? So these are the two important points that one needs to take care of as far as the use of proceeds is concerned. Then you have the process of project evaluation and selection, where the framework should be based on the decision processes, eligibility criteria, objectives of the environmental and guideline selections. How will the material, environmental and social risk be identified and managed? What should be the governance around the specificity of the roles, oversightness of the bodies? How will you include alignment with the broader corporate sustainability strategies and the due diligence? These are the focal points that one needs to take care of as far as the process of project allocation of fund, because the funds are going to be allocated based on certain parameters, as we said. That is where the management of proceeds also becomes important, because the issuers, they are expecting to track the proceeds via internal systems, as I said, some few minutes back, Some of the methods can be sub-portfolios of tracking tools that they have developed, the disclosure of temporary placement of unallocated funds, how is the target allocation happening within a defined time frame, what are the transparency controls, what are the periodic internal evaluation or verification systems that are being maintained in order to have this entire management of funds is there, or the proceeds are there. And obviously the reporting, as I mentioned over and over again, is a very important factor, because that is where your updates are coming in terms of any material changes that is happening, and alongside what is the impact when it is happening, what are the feasible and the relevant consistent KPIs that are being maintained, along with the stated methodologies and the approach that has been taken into account. And that is why these core green principles become very, very important. And that also brings us to another point, and this is regarding your capex versus refinancing and looking back and the reporting of the cadence, with the green bond principles. Because the capex versus refinancing, why the split actually matters, because the insurers should be able to quantify what proportion of proceed funds with the new green capex versus the refinancing of the existing eligible assets have been taken into consideration, because this is going to affect your narrative, the pipelining of the signaling for the investors, and the best practices to explain how will you refinance the support, how will you ensure that there is an ongoing green asset which is based on certain operating renewables, what are the outlining forward capex plans that are there, how will you demonstrate the transition movement, what are the look back periods for refinancing, because for refinancing portions the framework should state a defined look back window where you're looking at asset vintage or the years since completion, any criteria that are there around ensuring that assets are meeting eligibility thresholds and environmental objectives, along with the disclosure methodologies for the asset selection within the look back time period, and that is excluding your exclusions that are there. And then there's the impact of the reporting and the cadence and the rigor that has been taken into account when you're doing this ICMA GVP guidelining following, because wherever feasible there has to be an issue of annual impact reporting, which has been organized using various indicators such as megawatt generated, trillion carbon dioxide avoided, how much was the water that was saved, what was the baselining, what are the emission factors, how was the calculation done, what were the indices followed, how were these indices calculated, what is there out in the world to look at, from various documents that are available. And then you are going to explain your boundaries in terms of the scope and geography that have been taken into consideration, along with the assumption that the data quality controls so as to align with the ICMA's indicator guidance to ensure that there's an enablement of the cross-issuer comparisons. Now, here certain practical issues need to be taken into consideration as a mark of a workflow where you're looking at two factors. One is pre-issuance and two is post-issuance. So let's look at the first one. In terms of pre-issuance, in the framework, you're going to define your eligible categories, your capex refinancing policies, what are the look back periods, what is the reporting cadence, how will you obtain a second party opinion, what are they going to reflect in terms of the offering documents. And as far as the post issuance is concerned, once it has been done, then you have got to publish your annual allocation, the impact of the reports using ICMA templates, how will you clearly tag your data sets so as to ensure that index providers and the data vendors, they can ingest and split the KPI data and the KPIs significantly and programmatically over a given time period. So all this has to be again mentioned very clearly, both in terms of the pre-issuance and as well as the post-issuance. Another thing, when we look at it in terms of the the checklist that one needs to look at when you're going to be issuing. So there are certain issuer readiness checklist or guidelines. Let's look at all of them together at one given time period. The climate bond certification that is there for issuers starts from the preparation of the bond to engaging a verifier, to getting a certificate, to with the certified bond with confirmation of the certificate post issuance, and finally the reporting of the annual. How will you do that? Because the clarity on capex versus refinancing, the transparency look back, disciplining out reporting, cadence turning green bonds allocation into verifiable impact as investors can underwrite. That is the main focus of this issuer check guidelines that one is looking at. When you look at in terms of the same lines, when you look at it in terms of your, the eligible categories with the quantitative or standardized based certain thresholds, such as building your energy intensity levels, your renewables, or the project category, what is the referencing of the taxonomy wherever it is applicable, so as to ensure that there is comparability across the issuers and market. Explain how thresholds will align and the environmental objectives are being met with the relevant and transition pathways, so as to avoid your vague eligibility and your increases of the greenwashing risk. This is a very, very important point, Then exclusions have to be taken into account, whether you're going to list exclusions such as fossil fuel expansion, activities that are inconsistent with the stated objectives, so as to eliminate any ambiguity, and there is a signal integrity into the project selection. Then alignment with the recognized guidance and disclosures of any conditional cases to maintain transparency in the selection processes. Then the proceeds of tracking, when one looks at about implementing a tracked accounts or portfolio approaches to ring fence the net proceed, disclose any temporary placement of unallocated balances. The target of a very well-defined timeline has to be taken into consideration to have a full allocation. What you have to describe your internal controls, where it is relevant, what is relevant, what are the periodic internal or external checks that is there are going to be there on allocation of strengthening of the optibility. Then the standard proceeding operation or verification, that is very important. So there you have to do two things. One is to obtain a second party opinion, and two is to publish the scope, methodologies, exclusions of reviews, so that the investor can evaluate your assurance post assurance quality and comparability. And once this is done, the impact methodologies and the baselining that is there, very important point, because that is where you're going to provide your method notes for each KPIs that has been taken into consideration. This is going to include your baselining, your emission factors, the calculation of the approaches, the organizational and geographic boundaries, so as to enable your reproducibility. Then what is the use of, how will you use your ICMS harmonized indicators wherever it is available, maintenance of consistency year over year, explainability, any restatements or methodology changes for transparency purposes, and then the reporting cadence and the artifacts, because this is where you want to commit to at least your annual allocation reporting until full allocation is going to be taking place. The maintenance of accessible archive of frameworks, SPOs, offering of the document extracts, what are the annual reports, and all that factors that has been taken into consideration. So this is why this issuer checklist for your GBPs is very, very important point. That brings us to another important point, that is around sustainability linked bond principles, from where you're moving from your targets to all the way to terms, because there are certain core principle of sustainability linked bond principles, because that is where you're linking your cost of capital to real performance, because the selection of material KPIs, ambitious STPs, and hardwired accountability have been taken into consideration as far as the coupon is concerned. Because what makes SLBs different is because the proceeds may be for general corporate purposes, with accountability embedded in the performance against disclosed KPIs and STPs, rather than just ring fencing and enabling issuer level transition signaling. This is a very important point, because the contracts are going to be linked to the outcomes of economics through predefined observation dates, mechanisms, such as your coupon step up or step down. Other variation that is there documented in terms of the offering of the materials is there. Again, this has got 5 different pillars, KPIs to SPTs to variation in bond characteristics to reporting and verification. So let's look at them one at a time. As far as KPI is concerned, you're selecting a small set of material which is measurable, auditable there, with matrices, and which is reflecting your issuer's most significant sustainability levers, where you're avoiding immaterial and vanity indicators. Then you have the SPTs, where you're setting up your ambitious time-bound targets, you're aligning with the credible pathways, disclosing your baselining methodologies, and providing a rationale for ambition relative to peers and past performers. Then they have the variations in the bond characteristics, because that is where you're ensuring your financial changes, say any changes in coupon rates, economically meaningfulness, clear trigger logic, what is the observation date, how will you treat the methodologies that are there in terms of changes for M&A. But reporting and verification, as we have talked about over and over again becomes a very important point as a part of the 5 pillars for the principles of sustainability linked bond principles, Then another thing is around designing the credibility, where you're moving from KPIs to SPT to coupon mechanics. All of them have been interlinked or been taken into consideration, because that is where the observation date should occur early enough and at multiple points to us to keep your incentives alive and reduce all or nothing risk while you are aligning with reporting cycles and verification of the timing that is taking place. And the step size should be material relevant to be spread and credit your profile, and legal terms should include your fallback provisions of data restatements, methodology updates, boundary changes that have happened. Then there is going to be an alignment with the broader market architecture, because the SLB principles complement your green or the use of proceeds standard by shifting focus from asset eligibility to enterprise performance and improving your comparability when combined with harmonized reporting templates. Interoperability with taxonomies and disclosure regimes is again going to be supported through principles based on guidance, easing of the cross-border issuance, what is your invest diligence that is to be taken into consideration, And then again, following on the similar lines of the principles, they are going to move towards the definitions of the 5 different pillars, because you're going to tie up with a coupon to a few material KPIs, and you're going to set ambitious STPs, or rather SPTs, and you're going to verify your outcomes based on these so as to have a market credibility reinforced, because SLBs, they are not exactly, they'll be embedded accountability at the issuer level. The outcomes against the KPIs are going to drive your coupon term changes, any observation dates. They are not there for use of proceeds. They through issuers may run both the formats in parallel for the project transparency plus performance accountability. Because the proceeds are general purpose, their credibility relies on KPI materiality, SPT ambition, verification, scope, economic significance of the variation of the term variation, and not on the ring fencing of the project, something I just talked about a few minutes ago, because that is where your selection of KPI is one of the first pillars. We're choosing a small set of 2 to 3, which are very relevant, core and material to set the business model, which is going to be measurable on consistent terms, methodologies, externally verifiable. It is going to be benchmarked against peers and the pathways. So you're going to have a typical KPI in terms of emissions intensity, absolute emissions, renewable energy share, water intensity, safety rates, diversity, which have been selected based on sector materiality and data quality. That is very important. The second pillar is around calibration of SPTs, where the targets must exceed business as usual, and it has to be time bound. It has to align with the credible sector or the policy pathways, disclosures of baselining boundaries, rationale for the ambition versus peers and the history. It should include your interim waypoints and explain the treatment of methodology, the changes and mergers and acquisitions to preserve the target integrity across the bond life. Then the third pillar is around your bond characteristics, which is basically a financial variation, where you're defining your meaningful coupon, step up, step down, other terms changes that have been tied to KPI outcomes, where you're clearly outdated your observation, size step ups to be material relative to expected spreads, include the fallback provisions for data restatements or boundary updates to clarify your cumulative versus binary triggers in multiple KPI structures. The fourth and the fifth is obviously around the reporting and the verification. The fourth, as far as reporting is concerned, it is around providing the annual KPI so as to align with the timing and the observation dates and the archiving of the previous years for comparability and auditability. And as far as the verification is concerned, is again obtaining an independent external verification of the KPI and external opinion pre-issuance in terms of the framework or SPO, plus your post-issuance outcome verifications that are now baseline expectations to mitigate your greenwashing of the risk that is there. Now we come down to another important point is around designing the practices that needs to pass your diligence, because the sustainability financial approach has got 2 different distinct approaches. So if any analyst can replicate your numbers, penalties, bite on time, you pass material KPIs, ambitious targets, clear terms, verifiable reporting. They are the ones who are doing your actual heavy lifting. And as far as the two different frameworks or the approaches are concerned, one is around the green finance framework, where it comes in your green bonds, green loans, and the second is around sustainability linked finance framework, where the sustainability linked loans are going to come into picture. So two different, very clear, distinct approaches are there, as that has to be there taken into account, because you're going to select and material KPIs. So you're going to select very few, because that's where your material KPIs will come into picture. Generally, the thumb rule is around 2 to 3 decision, which is useful, auditable KPIs that are going to reflect your core value drivers, in terms of emission intensity, renewable of share, what is the water intensity, how will you avoid material or vanity matrices that are going to be there, how will you, this is going to fail your investor scrutiny. Then comes in the point of calibration of SPTs beyond business as usual, because it is here you're going to set the time-bound SPTs, which is going to align to recognized transition pathways with disclosed baseline methodologies and interim waypoints, so as to explain why targets are ambitious versus peers, documentation of the treatment of methodology changes and M&A to protect the target integrity. Then comes in the second point is around making the bond economics more meaningful, because it's where here the size of coupon, step up, step down, is going to be taken into consideration. This is where it's going to include your fallback provisions for the data restatements, boundary updates, clarification in terms of partial achievements. It is here you're going to nail your proceeds and governance for the UOP or user of proceeds bound, because that is where you're going to define your eligible criteria with thresholds and explicit exclusions, quantifiable capex versus refinancing of the splits with look back periods, tracking of the unallocated balances, transparencies with full allocation, commitment to at least annual allocation reporting, where is it feasible, the impact of the reporting, which have been harmonized indicators with clear methods for reproducibility, and the data discipline and the machine readable reporting, is a very, very important point that needs to be taken into consideration, because this is where you're going to harmonize your templates, which is going to be consistent with your field names for allocation impact in terms of UOP, that is user of proceeds, or KPI performances, with it's going to be with respect to SLB. Synchronization of the report timing, observation of the date, something again very, very deep impact as far as this sustainability linked bond principles, which is going to pass your due diligence, because it is going to have an impact on your SDG standardization. From the intention to decision quality is what we are looking at, because the governance data and the assurance will turn the purpose into credible capital allocation. And that is where your decarbonization to health and wellness, to resource management, to biodiversity, to compliance is all going to come into picture. Because what the standards are, it is a comprehensive set of decision-making standards, so as to integrate the SDGs into core business and investment purposes. That is the focus. How will you integrate your SDG goals with the core business purposes? How will you shift the focus from output to outcomes, and from labels to governance and management of the disciplines? This is where your 4 themes are going to come into picture. That is strategy management approach, transparency, and governance, and each with requirements that is going to drive the continuous improvement and comparable disclosures across entities and funds. Because let's look at the first one, the strategy. It is here that you're moving from purpose to priorities, because that is where the intention of the decision quality is going to come into picture. You're going to require your redefinement of the intended positive and negative impact, setting of the SDG linked objectives, targets, demonstrating alignment with business model, capital allocation, material SDG outcomes, emphasis on the context analysis, stakeholders that needs to be ensured that the chosen SDG target are relevant, time-bound, supported by resources and capabilities. The management approach in terms of execution and control, because the mandate is there to integrate your impact with policies, risk management, decision gates, with roles, responsibilities, incentives that have been tied up with the management across the SDG performance. Because there is going to be a requirement of the robust measurement systems for outcomes with documented methodologies, baselining, data quality controls. The transparency is another important factor because the decision usefulness of the disclosures come into picture. Because this is where the call for public reporting is going to be important, that where you're going to explain the theory of changes, material impacts, outcome indicators, baselines, methods, limitations to allow the users to interpret performance. The governance, accountability and assurance is the focus, which is requiring your board level oversight of SDG strategy and risk, clear escalation pathways, periodic independent assurances as far as alignment to SDGs impact standards assurance schemes is concerned, position assurance as a credibility mechanism that is going to validate both the processes as well as how will it impact the influence with the key decisions, and not just the ex post metrics, position of the assurance as credibility mechanism that is going to validate both the processes and the reporting outcomes. That is where it is complementation of ICMA and the product framework, because the SDG impact standards is going to strengthen your enterprise decision quality and underpin your ICMA aligned bond frameworks. And it is going to provide a consistent backbone for private equity and corporate issuers to map the SDG targets to capital allocation, portfolio management, and reporting so that the investors can do their due diligence. So next thing that we're going to be talking about is the impact of the SDG standards. It's a very important point again, because that is where your backbone of the credibility of the entire framework of your green bonds and everything else with the SDG standards comes into picture. Because you see, use of the SDG standards to hardwire the purpose into decisions, and that is going to set your enterprise objectives, embed the risk, and then the bonds are going to be what the investors are going to trust. And this is the entire approach all the way from starting to end, from which turns out to be your how you project to green finance instruments to all the way down to annual or external compliances. Because why even use SDG impact before issuing a bond? That is a very fundamental question that one has in mind. Why should I even look at it? Because there are two reasons primarily. One is the enterprise first design, and second is the decision quality. So let's look at the first one, that is enterprise first design. So the SDG impact is requiring your define the intended positive as well as negative outcome. And you've got to prioritize your SDG targets. So that's to align your capital with those in the priorities. And this is the one that is going to give credibility to the backbone of the entire framework that is set regarding the fund allocation. And then the use of the green proceeds for sustainability linked frameworks. And then comes in the second point, as I said, the decision quality, because you're going to embed your impact into strategy, risk management, incentives, data systems. And then the SDG impact is going to upgrade your internal controls. So the bond is going to disclose and it's going to reflect your real choices and not the ones that are based on marketing by various players involved in this game. And that also brings us to another point, and that is about connecting the use of proceeds bond. So your GBP, SBP and SBG. So how will you have the strategy for eligibility is the first thing that you need to look at, because your SDG priorities is going to inform which categories, thresholds are going to enter the bond framework, provide the specificity of eligible projects and exclusions under the ICMA components. And then the impact methodologies has to be looked at. So that is where the standards require baselining, your outcome logic, the data quality controls, how they translate directly into the decision useful allocation. The impact methodologies require your standardization in terms of the standards, which is requiring your baselining, outcome logic, data quality controls, which is going to translate directly into decision useful allocations, or the impact of reporting the investors, which is going to be expected in the ICMA aligned bonds. So primarily two reasons why this entire connection of use of proceeds with the bonds is going to be very, very important factors. And once you have done that, then you have got to connect with the sustainability linked bond or SLB. And therefore the KPI selection and the SPT credibility becomes very important, because the SDGs impact on materiality and stakeholder context will help to pick a small set of issuer level KPIs, which is actually mattering for any real SDG outcomes and the business value propositions. And the credibility is another one, because the governance and the management requires your support, which is time bound beyond your STPs and your documented methodologies and boundaries, so as to strengthen your verification and observation dates. Then comes in the risk and the impact processes and the standards that is requiring. So risk is again a very, very important point as far as the standardization of the SDGs is concerned, because that is where you got to look at it very closely. The factors of greenwashing and other factors of non-alignment of the principles which we discussed a few minutes ago. So the risk impact integration, when we look at it, it is going to mandate the process to identify, manage and escalate material impacts and the risks that are there across the enterprises, so as to have a clear roles, your designation gates and the board oversight. And when you're going to measure the discipline, you're going to require your outcome indicators, your baselines, the methods, so as to have the external parties so that they can interpret and compare performance consistency over a given time period. A transparency and assurance for the bond investors, again, fact that you need to have a confidence of the bond investors as well, is where the public disclosures and the assurance readiness comes into picture. Because the public disclosure is going to encourage the publishing of the theory of change, materials impact, methodologies, boundaries, limitations, foundations and that is going to give you the credibility of foundation, the credible bond reporting and your external reviews. So that gives the confidence to the investor community as large. And the assurance readiness is going to provide an assurance scheme that is going to validate both the process as well as the reported outcomes that have been stated very clearly. So as to enhance again the trust in the bond and frameworks and post issuance of reports, something we just talked about a slide ago with respect to pre and post issuance of the report. So if you look at it from the practically, how will you issue a workflow, you need to have a pre-issuance and again post-issuance rather. So if you look at the pre-issuance, you're going to conduct your SDG gap assessments. You're going to set the SDG linked enterprise objectives, document the risk impact processes, indicators, baselines, governance, and then finally draft your ICM aligned bond framework, which is going to form this backbone. As far as the post-issuance, from the practical issuer workflow is concerned, that is where the reporting or the allocation and the impact of the UOP that is there, or the KP or the SPT, along with the performance of SLB, is going to be the same as the SDG impact methods and governance. How will you enable the auditability? What is your year-on-year comparability? These points needs to be taken into consideration when you are looking at the post-issuance factors, because that is where practically, you need to have a factors of the workflow, as I would say. So once we've looked at this, that brings me to another point, and that is around the principles of practice. Have an end-to-end issuance of the playbooks. Because the standards, the processes, they're going to verify the claims, the report, they're going to be working like a clockwork, And this is how the principles are going to turn the tables into investable and index-ready securities. Because if you closely monitor the feasibility versus the ambitiousness has been set up. This is from one of the reports that have come around, which countries and what is the high feasibility, very low feasibility, and all the factors have been taken into consideration. And if you look at the cycle that is there, it starts all the way from KPI linked sovereign bond maturity to going to the positive impact, spelling out your, to lower sovereign and private borrowing costs, to increasing your fiscal headroom, private investments. All of them are completely interlinked, starting from the KPI linked bond market. So that is where the green use of proceeds, or GBP as we call it, the pre-issuance is going to be around defining the eligible categories, thresholds, listing of the exclusions, disclosing financing versus refinancing split, look backs, outlining your selection governance, environment, social risk controls, and the framework. Again, obtaining a second party opinion on GBP alignment is very important, because that is going to where you're going to reflect the key terms in offering documents, such as use of proceeds, selection processes, management of proceeds, reporting commitments. Then the playbook also includes the second point is around issuance and governance. So here the ring fencing, tracked accounts or portfolio approach, disclosure of the temporary placement of unallocated funds and timeline to full allocation is important. Establishment of internal controls wherever appropriate, external checks on allocation of tracking for auditability. Then post-issuance reporting and assurance for the green or use of proceeds bonds, that it's called as. The report allocation at least annually until fund has been completely allocated, providing the impact KPIs wherever it is feasible to measure, with baselines, emission factors, and methods for reproducibility. So, and also the archiving of the reports for comparability. Considering post-issuance verifications for allocations on impact to enhance the credibility and support of the index inclusion workflows. Then in the second playbook, we're looking at the sustainability linked bonds, SLBP. Again, the same terms, pre-issuance frameworks. Again, select very small, say 2 or 3 material auditable KPIs, tie them to the core value drivers, calibrate, be ambitious, time-bound SPTs, alignment to credible pathways, disclosures of baselines, scopes, methods, designing of the meaningful term variation in terms of coupon step up, step down, setting early clear observation dates, defining fallback for methodology changes or merger and acquisition, securing an SPO or framework quality. Term sheet and legal drafting, it comes in terms of your specifying your KPI definition, SPT formulas, observation calendars, trigger logic, step magnitudes, change management clauses. So the economics are transparent and enforceable. And term sheet and legal drafting is also about, ensuring your reporting cadence is aligning with the observation dates, pre-committing to external verification of the KPI outcomes at or near observation, dates. Post-issuance information or issuance performance and verification, it would include your publication of at least annual KPI updates. Then data and templates, it's also for reducing your diligence framework or friction, because this is where the use of harmonized templates and indicator guiding to deliver machine-readable allocation impacts or KPI SPT data sets, which is going to include your baselines, factors, boundaries. This is an important factor which needs to be taken into consideration. And finally, the governance and the interoperability is going to align the frameworks to ICMA while mapping eligible criteria categories to your various KPIs so as to relate to have relevant taxonomies and disclosures regime, principles that are designed to complement regional rules, reduce your greenwashing risk through standardized processes and assurance. The regular ICMA updates, including incorporate market learning, strengthening of the comparability, and keeping the playbooks current and evolving your expectations on reporting and verification. So this is the entire chain of the approach as far as the end-to-end assurance of the playbooks is concerned. Because that also brings us to the next point is, okay, I've had a playbook. Now, how do I have a framework which is going to be verified, and will have an impact measurements? And that is where, things like your renewable energies, take the case of renewable energies, what are the factors that needs to be taken into consideration? If we look at sustainability and water waste management, what are the factors we need to take into consideration? Because you're going to align your ICMA to get your SPO and the lack of terms and documents and then report like a clockwork. This is how the proceed of investments, how use of proceeds become actually investable impact is going to be measured. So for various kind of situations like renewable energy to green, to sustainable waste and biodiversity, green buildings, a lot of factors have been mentioned which needs to be having an impact, because that is where the verifiability of your playbook is going to come into picture, because your publication of a public framework is going to specify eligible categories, thresholds, exclusions, governance, your project evaluation, selection, management of proceeds, reporting of the commitments which have been mapped to the various 4 GBP components. How will you disclose your capex versus refinancing split, look back periods for refinanced assets? Explain how the categories and advanced stated environmental objectives and relevant taxonomies have been based. The offering documents in terms of UOP selection and the proceeds are going to embed your core terms in offering documents, exclusive use of proceeds into eligible categories, decision processes, oversight of selection, proceeds tracking approach, disclosure of the temporary placement and unallocated balances, target timelines to full allocation consistent with the GBP expectations and the issuer controls. The reporting, which is going to be allocation at least until full allocation or covering of the amount have been allocated, the percentage of the financing versus refinancing. What is the look back, unallocated balance, temporary placement of proceeds, maintenance of accessible archive and continuing updates upon material changes to preserve comparability across years. The controls and verifications are a very important point, because this is where you're going to have to describe your internal controls for proceeds tracking, considering your post-issuance external verification has taken place for allocation of and selection. Impact indicators have been clearly marked. There's an enhancement of integrity and investment in the investor confidence that is there. It's displayable, and the alignment of the verification cadence with reporting cycles so as to support your index inclusion processes and ongoing monitoring by the investors. This the entire approach for the controls and the verification as far as your playbook, verifiability or the impact awareness that is going to be taking place. Then another factor that brings us to the similar line is I've got my SLB playbook now. From framework to verified performance, how do I go to that point? Because you're going to make the performance pay. When you want to pick up your material KPIs beyond your BAU SPTs and price the meaningful step up and verify the very clear clock investors that can trust, and that is where again the framework setup becomes very important, because this is where you're going to publish your aligned SLB framework, define the sustainability strategy, KPI universe, considering rationale for the selection of KPIs, SPTs, setting approach, reporting cadence, external verification of the commitments, the state governance, for the KPI ownership, internal controls, escalation paths, so as to have investors so that they can assess the data reliability and accountability before issuance. The KPI selection is going to be around, again, choosing very small 2 or 3 decision useful. This is going to be auditable KPIs. This is going to reflect your core enterprises, value drivers and sector materiality in terms of your absolute emissions or intensity, even in terms of renewable share, water intensity, safety. This is going to be consistent with the definitions and the boundaries. So as to have an explanation around the relevance, data quality, benchmarkability versus the peers, and recognizing the pathways to enable the investor comparison and ambition checks. Because the economics around the modeling for step sizes and observation dates have the size coupon step up and down, other term variations to be material relative with expected spreads and the model sensitivity under multiple scenarios to avoid diminishing of the incentives, setting up the multiple early observation dates to keep incentives live, aligning them with the internal reporting and external verification calendars for operational feasibility. The term sheet triggers and the verification covenants, in the legal document is going to specify the KPI definitions, SPT formulas, observation of the calendars, triggering of the logic, step magnitudes, cumulative versus binary mechanics, or the fallback provisions for the restatements, or even the boundary changes, because it is here that you're going to embed your covenants requiring independent verification of the KPI outcomes at or near observation date with the public disclosures and the verifiable scope and standards. And the annual KPI reporting and assurance is where you're going to publish your external verification of the KPI outcomes at the observation date. And that is why once we have all these things, we also need to look at the data and the taxonomy, which is a very, very important point in life, because that is where the comparability of the backbone in terms of the sustainable finance is coming into picture. And this is what the data and taxonomy, when you look at it from the perspective of an issuer, what actually it means. From the issuer's perspective, data is about provide and KPI SPT fields with baseline, methods, frameworks, in an harmonized format so as analysts can reproduce results them programmatically. While taxonomy actually means from the issuer's perspective or KPIs to recognize classifications, framework, comparability, cross-border acceptance in investors' workflow. Now, taxonomy factor, the machine-readable reporting practices. There is a use of ICMA's harmonized, include your standards or unit standards, say megawatt hours, trillion carbon dioxide emitted, emission factors, calculation approaches, asset vintages, look back periods for refinancing. How will you maintain an accessible evidence pack, so as to have a framework, SPO, offering your extracts, annual reports, keeping a year-over-year archivability for auditability and index inclusion. The taxonomy alignment and the crossworks or crosswalks would start with ICMA categories or UOP or KPI families for SLBs, and then add crosswalks to relevant regional taxonomy or policy frameworks so as to support the local compliance and the global comparability. Because then the documentation of the thresholds, exclusions, rationale for the eligibility mapping, so that peer reviewers can trace decisions from strategy to asset to KPI selection is taking place. The factor of data and taxonomy also looks at data quality controls and verification. It is here that you are describing your internal controls for proceeds, tracking or KPI data ownership, scheduling internal checks, committing to external verification of allocation or KPI outcomes at observable dates, publishing verifier scope and standards with data sets, enabling consistent assessment by investors, data vendors, index providers. So this is going to reduce your diligence friction, because here you're going to have an harmonized taxonomy mapped data, which is letting the investors standardize screening, speeds, index eligibility reviews, improvements in secondary market transparency, lowering of the transaction cost for the issuers. Because the regular ICMA updates are needed to keep the indicators and templates aligned with the market needs, and preserving of the comparability as themes expand, say, in terms of adaptation, transition, nature. So that is why your data and taxonomy, when you look at it in terms of comparability factor and the sustainability finance, they become very important, because the key consideration that you need to set as choose as the green definitions to current options that are available as the green definitions itself. The entire, the fact that how do you data and the taxonomy align together with each other is an important point. And that brings us to another point, and that is the data discipline. So you're looking from PDFs to pipelining method, and therefore the data vendor can ingest and analyze so as to reproduce year-bound investable. And machine readable and allocation impact on the KPI data sets is going to provide you feeds for allocation, impact of the KPI and everything else, the harmonization of the impact matrices, because your use of ICMA's indicator guidance for common KPIs with the stated emissions factors, methodologies, geographic organized boundaries for reproducibility. Verifiable metadata or as a credible signal includes your attachment of verifier information in terms of firm, scope, standards applied, conclusions that have been drawn, allocations, impact, KPI outcomes at observation days. It also includes your synchronization of the verification and the reporting cadence, and that is where I will take everybody to a website, and it's a very interesting one, which is going to talk about your macroeconomic climate data indicators dashboard. Here you can look at a lot of things. You can download your data, you can view the full details. So you have various things like, Andorra, country-wise, and you have the indicators, what kind of indicator has been taken into consideration, what is the source that has been mentioned, code that is there, name, descriptor, bond type, who's been the insurer, what are the proceeds, principal currency, what about the unit over a given time period, how it has happened. So they have taken all the way from 2006 to 2024 till this is the latest one. One needs to go at this website and check it out. It's a very interesting one, because it's where a lot of these indicator dashboards are there, and it is indicating the kind of bonds that have been issued, who has issued, which country has issued. So an interesting website one should definitely visit, and you can clearly see, and you can download your data as well, as you can clearly see from here. That brings me to the final point, and that is about when you have a large systems that is flowing into factors. How do you take the data ingestion from the vendor's perspective, because the vendor is going to provide you multiple data sets. So you can have vendors like Bloomberg as an example, if I would take that as an example perspective. Here I've tried to show you this is a screen from the Bloomberg terminal, for the bond description, the GLB bond description. And you can have Bloomberg, you can have, environmental finance, you can have Dealogic and CBI. All of them are there, that is their providers of the, data, vendor data, for the ingestion and index inclusion. So this is where the principal alignment plus machine readability reporting, that is the gateway to your inclusion. When you're looking at it from the vendor ingestion, the principles again aligned to the frameworks will enable your fast ingestion, because this is where the publication of the ICMA aligned framework that is going to clearly provide evidence for the 4 GBP components or the 5 visibility pillars, using your current ICMA guidelines so as to tighten up the eligibility definitions. The machine readable reports is going to reduce your diligence friction, because they're going to provide you allocation and impact tables or the KPI, SPT, time series and the SLBs in the harmonized templates with units, baselines, factors, scopes, boundaries, so that the results are reproducible and auto-classifiable. And you can maintain a versioned public evidence pack, framework, SPO, offering extracts, annual reports, verifiable opinions, Because the verifier metadata is the credibility to the signal that the vendors are reading. Because that is when they're attaching the verifier name, scope, standards, applied observation dates, conclusions, data platform that can flag assurance, quality, and indication of the confirmation of the eligibility, synchronization of the verification with reporting cadence to keep the vendor and data assets current and minimizing your index inclusions. Taxonomy of the mapping is going to support your cross-border inclusions, where you're looking at mapping your ICMA categories or KPI families to relevant regional taxonomy in the same data set, documenting your thresholds, exclusion to satisfy your multiple index, keeping the crosswalks consistent year on year. And if you look at it from the practical aspect of life, when you're handling a large scale data infusion platforms, is you're going to have a few checklists for the issuer's perspective. That's where the principles of the alignment framework published, the SPO obtained, offering of the documents, which is including a UOP or SLBs, For the SLBs, it's going to be around early and dated observation points, economically meaningful, step up, step down. So, pretty interesting approach for the vendor ingestion data and their index inclusion is going to be there. I would suggest that people go down and look at some of these terminals and look at the available. This one, by the way, is from the Bloomberg, so you can look at it out here. And that brings me to the end of this discussion on this series of ESG analytics and green finance. My name is Atul Tripathi, and I'm honorary adjunct fellow at National Maritime Foundation. Thank you.